thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure and privilege to be here tonight. And thank you to you all, because I have to say that's one of the more boring titles I've ever come up with, but you've stuck with it, which is fantastic. Basically, this stemmed from a paper I did for a conference on the Declaration of Arbroath, which was, of course, due to take place in 2020, and obviously didn't. And it subsequently, the papers became a special issue of the Scottish Historical Review. So as a result of what the referee said in that, I've kind of got more focused on what I think was going on. Of course, it all stems to a large extent from the outcome of the Battle of Bannockburn, which you would think was all positive. And of course, any of us who took part in the 700th anniversary commemoration in 2014, we're actually struggling to think of things that actually positively came out of Bannockburn for the Scots, apart from, of course, enhancing Robert Bruce's reputation for all time. So, as far as Robert Bruce was concerned, it was business as usual after Bannockburn in terms of trying to get a peace treaty on Scottish terms, that is, an acknowledgement of Scottish independence and his right to be King of Scots, from Edward II. And that, as far as Bruce was concerned, was very much based on a military strategy, and that's going to be very important to the story, because that required him, after 1316, that entailed him having to try to ignore what the Pope wanted. It does, of course, also provide the context to why the Declaration of Arbroath was sent. And it illuminates both the pluses and minuses for both kings, the King of England and the King of Scots, in that period after 1314. And it also helps us to sort of establish the impact of the war and the achievements or reverse for both men that will be important going forward. So that's the general view. There are three key dates, which I will test you on later. First of all, the Council of Vienne, which took place between 1311 and 1312, which decided that Europe should once again engage in a crusade to recover the Holy Land, which had now been wholly lost to them. Then, in August 1316, the election of a Pope, Pope John XXII, after a hiatus, very important, of 2 years when there had been no pope. So between 1314 and 1316, there had been no pope. And this was not just any pope. This was a very, wily was one of the words used to describe him. This is a man, a lawyer, who knew what he was about. And then, very, very important to this story, the death on 14th of October 1318 of Robert Bruce at Faughart in Ireland. So those three dates are going to feature heavily. I'm arguing for a failure at Bannockburn in that the key needs, desires of the Scottish king are not met, and negotiations begin with the English almost immediately. But there's a fundamental contradiction. I've already told you what Robert Bruce wants: acknowledgement of an independent Scotland and his right to be king. Edward II, not as effective as his father Edward I, but equally stubborn, is never going to grant that. And what's interesting is that the one tangible result of Bannockburn is indeed the exchange, the prisoner exchange that resulted in the Queen of Scotland, Elizabeth de Burgh, and Bruce's daughter, Marjorie, their return in 1315. But even that didn't make a huge amount of difference. I mean, obviously that meant that Bruce could himself have potentially a son, which is a plus, but they had already decided that what Scotland, of course, needed in those circumstances was an adult male as king. So Marjorie's rights to be queen as the king's daughter were put aside in favour of her uncle, Edward Bruce, who had been the de facto heir, but now was officially recognised as such at Ayr. Now, what you see unleashed is Robert Bruce's imagination in terms of the military options that he could employ against the English. There has been raiding, well, there's been raiding off and on for most of the war, but since 1311, that has been Bruce's policy. But after 1314, it's upped, to state-of-the-art raiding. They really get this down good. It is, of course, initially, total hit and runs, the removal of anything that they could get their hands on, and then develops into the system of blackmail, where individual communities will negotiate with the Scots to make sure that they don't experience that, and that's the road to the next lot if you want to go down it. Out the way, thank you very much. So that's an important policy, and that is intended to suggest to Edward II he might lose part of northern England to the Scots, which has been the bane of contention between them for centuries. That certainly he will lose revenue because communities are paying all that to the Scots. They then argue that they can't then pay it to the English treasury, so there is a diminution of Edward's own income. But nonetheless, this policy is problematic because, for the simple geographical reason that the north of England is a long way from Edward II, and in the end, he doesn't care enough. The Scots also do try in 1315 to take the city of Carlisle, and there's a wonderful picture of Andrew Hartley in Carlisle rebuffing Robert Bruce and his siege engines, which is unusual on the Scottish side. So there is failure in that respect to take an actual city, a key city, which back in the day David I had managed to take and therefore control that part of northern England. And then, of course, also in 1315, Edward Bruce this is the next, they've obviously sat down, what can we do now? And he's dispatched to Ireland. The story goes that he wanted a crown of his own, and you can believe that if you like, but it seems to me that this is very much part of a strategy on the part of his brother to put as much pressure on the English as possible. Ireland is a lordship of England, and there are many Anglo-Irish there, including Robert Bruce's own father-in-law, the Earl of Ulster. So he's dispatched and is lauded as High King of Ireland, so tackling the Gaelic Irish, the native Irish. That takes a lot of resources. I mean, it's true that the raiding does give the Scottish Treasury a huge amount to cushion the effects of a deteriorating climate in this period that will result in cattle disease and failed harvests, which is going to affect everybody in this period. Also cushions the effect of continuing warfare even after Bannockburn, when most Scottish castles, most of Scotland after Bannockburn is in Bruce's hands. It's really only Berwick that isn't. So if Bruce wants to continue the war, it means he doesn't have to tax his own people, which would make him unpopular, funnily enough. So, but nonetheless, the Irish campaign does take a lot of time and effort. The king's heir is out on military campaign. The king himself goes over to Ireland on several occasions, as does Thomas Randolph, the king's nephew, and one of his important commanders. So it does, take quite a lot of effort on the Scots' side. The Isle of Man is lost briefly to the Scots, partly probably precipitating the Irish venture. The Isle of Man, hugely strategically important in terms of controlling the Irish Sea, and Randolph manages to take it back again, 1317 to 18. And there's even a suggestion, certainly believed by the English, that the Scots were actually targeting this time the Anglo-Welsh, the Marcher lords, those who were disaffected with Edward II in Wales. So you can see that Bruce is leaving no stone unturned in his attempts to try to get Edward II to the negotiating table and willing to give Scotland its independence, as we shall see, to no effect. Now, obviously, it wasn't a great day for Edward II, was it? The 24th of June, 1314. But, as I've already said, it didn't budge him 1 inch in terms of his attitude to Scotland. Scotland was his, and okay, he didn't actually hold it, but that was only, circumstances. It was a bad day. It's true that his cousin, Thomas of Lancaster, led an opposition to Edward, who wasn't very impressed with Edward's performance and wanted to curtail his, clip his wings, any expenditure they wanted to supervise, that sort of thing. And that is going to have an impact on the war because the opposition sort of berated Edward for failing to have Scotland, but wouldn't give him the money to campaign there, which might have brought it about. Good for Bruce. There is no return English campaign to Scotland, well, he wasn't going to know this, none of them knew this until 1319. So he had a good few years without having to worry about an invading army. Right, so Robert Bruce is out the country, his brother's out the country, and Thomas Randolph is out the country. But given that there isn't, there isn't an English campaign, that's not too bad. The raiding on northern England is largely led by James Douglas, who is unusually suited to that. Yeah, the Irish campaign can take up quite a lot of Scottish time. And then, as I said, in the August, we have the election of Pope John XXII. The previous pope had wanted this too, but John XXII was absolutely determined to launch this crusade. And to that end, he obviously had to stop the warring parties of Europe from fighting each other so they could go and fight the Muslims instead. He also had noticed, he could see he was almost immediately going into the bookkeeping side of being pope and realizing that a lot of papal revenues people hadn't bothered to pay in the hiatus between the two popes. So there was a lot of back pay to come from Britain and Ireland. And also as a money-making venture, this new pope decided that he had the right of presentation to bishoprics, archbishoprics, that sort of thing, which kings liked to control themselves, because obviously the Church of medieval Europe is vitally important to the administration of kingdoms, and so kings like to have their guys in, and that's going to become a very important issue going forward. As you can see, King Edward, the minute he had arranged a truce, because that meant that technically there shouldn't be any raiding, and that's helpful to him, and that meant Bruce could concentrate on Ireland. So there is a truce in place between the two kingdoms. But immediately that the Pope is appointed, Edward's right in there with a major, major embassy to go to Avignon, which arrives by the beginning of 1317. And it's got quite a lot of clout. It's armed with the English version of Anglo-Scottish relations. It's rightfully ours, and Robert Bruce has stolen it. And Robert Bruce is a bad man because he murdered John Comyn, etc., etc. And they also were arranging pensions for cardinals to be amenable. So this was a major push to assert the diplomatic initiative. Now we've got a new pope on England's behalf. Crucially, of course, we have the death of Robert Wishart, the Bishop of Glasgow, which is very hard to say fast. So if you want to go in and do that at your leisure, do try. Wishart, of course, has been a stalwart of the independence, the whole issue, even from the death of Alexander III back in the 1280s. He was a guardian of Scotland in that difficult period, and has been very supportive of Robert Bruce when he initially became king. So this is a personal blow to Robert Bruce, but it's also a bit of a headache because of the issue of because Scotland doesn't have an archbishop. Scottish bishops, they usually go to Rome, or in this case they're in Avignon, to be formally made bishop. So that's going to be a bit of a difficulty, given that there are other things pulling at Bruce that make him wish to ignore the Pope. So the Glasgow chapter elects Stephen Dunadir, but of course Edward II claims that right of presentation as well, so he has his own candidate. Now is when things start to get a little bit heated. To begin with, of course, the English embassy makes it to Avignon and informs the Pope of their version of events as far as Scotland is concerned. But Pope John XXII, as I said, is very wily. He has his end game always firmly in his mind, and his end game is the crusade. And it doesn't mean he doesn't get very annoyed when people don't give him the due respect that he thinks he's entitled to, as we will see, but it does mean that he leaves doors open. He does never really close his doors to the extent that they can't be opened again, and that also is going to influence how he acts in terms of Anglo-Scottish affairs. In April, he sends letters out that cover every possible circumstance. And fairly quickly, he confronts the really tricky issue is, what the heck do you call Robert Bruce? Because, of course, as far as the Scots are concerned, he's king. Well, most Scots, not all. As far as Edward II is concerned, he is not. He's just Robert Bruce. So that is going to prove really, really sticky. By the time the Scottish candidate for Glasgow, Stephen Dunadir, he goes to Rome, we don't know quite what happens. He's going to go back to Scotland, but is expected to return, it's not Rome, Avignon, to return to Avignon, but he dies on the route. And by this time, the Pope has said he's now going to present to all these bishoprics and archbishoprics. So that proves a problem back in Scotland, for the simple reason that, as far as this story is concerned, the reason why Robert Bruce needs to control who in his key bishoprics is because the Scottish Church is so vital to the control of information within Scotland, and that is going to be really, really important. So, Edward has his own candidate, this John Egglescliffe, and in this year also, papal legates and 2 cardinals are sent to Britain to deal with a range of affairs, including the difficulties between Edward II and his cousin Thomas of Lancaster. That is also a source of disquiet, but includes the Scottish question as well. And England is not, sweetness and light either in this period. There is a rebellion in the north of England, and papal envoys being sent with the Pope's letters to Robert Bruce get caught up in that uprising and are assaulted and are very, very upset. I think the Pope has no time for that. He says, just get on with it, is basically his response. So the Pope, again, he's not getting he hasn't heard anything from Robert Bruce at this point in time. It's all Edward. But the Pope is prepared to allow Edward's candidate for Glasgow to go forward, although we should be under no illusions that this man could actually set foot in Glasgow. He couldn't. But he wasn't prepared to get rid of William Lamberton, the Bishop of St Andrews, long-term Bishop of St Andrews, saying he doesn't know any outstanding issues against Lamberton. It's not for the King of England to tell him who should be bishop. So, getting to the rub of the matter. When is a king not a king? So the cardinal's messengers finally make it across the border. And Bruce meets them, and he's very, very nice to them. He gives them all due courtesy, etc. And then so they bring out the letters, and Bruce goes, okay, who are they addressed to? And they say, Robert Bruce. And he goes, well, there's an awful lot of Robert Bruces in Scotland, and they call them governor of the Kingdom of Scotland. And some of them are governing parts of Scotland, so how do we know which one this should go to? I mean, that's actually what he said. And they said, well, obviously it's you. And he's going, well, I'm king. Why does it not say I'm king? And they said, well, that would prejudge the issue of whether you have the right to be king. And he says, well, not calling me king also prejudges the issue, which is a fair point. And he says, well, anyway, I can't, this is a serious matter. I can't say anything about that. I'm going to have a big meeting of my magnates so we talk this through, and I'll get back to you by Michaelmas, by the end of September. So no one's fooled that this means that there's going to be any response. So that is the problem. The Pope can send as many missives as he likes, but Robert Bruce is not going to read them. Now that's fine, but it also means that Robert Bruce is not able to engage in European diplomacy directly because he's not speaking to the Pope. And given that the issue of Glasgow is outstanding, that is a problem. So it's not all, it's not just a question, I'll ignore the Pope and he'll hopefully go away. It is a problem for Scotland, which at this point is fairly diplomatically isolated, given that France and England are at peace. Edward II is, of course, brother-in-law to, I don't know why I'm saying of course, he's brother-in-law to the French King Philip V. So what Pope John does is again, he's a good fudger, this guy. He basically says, well, we can call you king, it won't make any difference to whether you actually are or not. And he writes to Edward II saying, is that okay with you? Please make it okay, because what we really need here is peace. And if that's going to get us peace, then that's what we've got to do. But the mail continues to be undeliverable. As I said, message control is vital to Bruce, and he's very good at it, as he is with propaganda and stuff like this. It's quite clear, because when the first papal messengers come to Scotland and they get treated nicely by Bruce, there's another guy who's arrived in Scotland 3 months previously, just with letters telling the Scots of the Pope's coronation, that he's not even been allowed to see Bruce. He's still sitting there going, I can't get in, I can't go home, I can't do anything. So the Scots hadn't even wanted to know there was a pope. It quite suited them to pretend ignorance of that. So pretending ignorance is a major part of Robert Bruce's policy at this point. So this, because, you know, if there are awkward things coming out of Avignon, then Robert Bruce's control over the Scottish Church means that people don't need to know about it. And one of the things that the Pope has done in sending the two cardinals to Britain is to promulgate a papal truce between Scotland and England. There already is a truce in place, but this new one will take effect, I think, from the end of 1317. So that's what the messengers had, and that Bruce wouldn't read. So the cardinals try again, and they use a man who's the where is he? The friar preacher of Berwick. He's sent up, and he goes out of Berwick, and he finds Bruce in a forest about 18 miles to the north of Berwick, and is very alarmed because there are lots of siege engines and lots of equipment and lots of things that make it very clear that Robert Bruce wants to take Berwick, where he's just come from. But nonetheless, Bruce said, no, it's fine, I'll give you a safe conduct. So he goes back and he gets his paperwork that he's left behind, and he comes back. But the king is nowhere to be found. He's not allowed to see Robert Bruce. And there's members of the king's household who say, okay, to whom are these letters addressed? Robert Bruce. Well, he's not going to read them. But what the friar does, and this is interesting because it's the first reference I found in written record of the Scots language, the Scots vernacular, because what the friar Adam does is he garbles it out, he just spits out this truce in Scots to the gathering throng, because so that they can't say they don't know. Because that's what he knows that's what they're doing, that they're just trying to pretend that they don't know about this papal truce. And that it's important to him, of course, because if there is a papal truce, then they can't be taking Berwick. Okay? So that's the importance of that. Bruce continued to say, well, I didn't hear it. He never said it to me. But everyone else did hear it. So, yes, again, the cardinals have been given letters to both King Robert and to Robert Bruce, but they don't seem to have used them, or at least Robert Bruce kept up this pretense that you couldn't possibly open letters addressed to this boy, Robert Bruce, that nobody knows who he is. So, yes, going into 1318, Bruce... There's been various attempts on Berwick. There was a near miss by James Douglas, but a dog barked and alerted the people inside Berwick. So that was scotched. I think that was in 1316. But King Robert wants it now. It's the last piece of the jigsaw. So 1318 that's very much in his focus. As I say, the Isle of Man is recaptured by Thomas Randolph, so there's still things going on out to the west. But the Irish campaign is ongoing, but now we're in a period of extreme famine, where the Irish hated the Scots just as much as the English, because obviously a large Scottish army eats stuff and takes stuff, and is very, very unpopular. So although there had been great achievement with the capture of Carrickfergus, the port town, now the Scots in Ireland were in a defensive mode. They were kind of kept in one place, and it was very difficult to see where this was going. So it's okay, but it's not great. 1318, April 1318, Berwick town is captured by treachery from within. Basically, somebody inside had made an agreement to open the gates, and the Scots got in. The castle holds out for maybe about 6 weeks, but it too falls. So Berwick, that's finally Scotland back to its 1296 borders. But the Scots don't stop there, which is interesting. By this time, the papal truce should have taken effect. But Bruce ignores it, of course, and he does a huge raid into northern England as far as Yorkshire, which is a long way. Even on the train, it's quite a long way, down into Yorkshire, raiding quite intensively and excessively, you might say. So really ramping up the pressure on Edward II. At this point, the Pope is starting to lose the rag a bit. at Robert Bruce because, you know, he keeps sending these letters. He knows that, because Friar Adam has written back to the cardinals who write to him to say that they do know about this truce, they're just pretending not to. And so he starts, I mean, he's a good letter writer, or his secretariat. I mean, it's constant. I mean, the litany of Bruce's crimes and misdemeanors. Only very briefly does he mention the murder of John Comyn. It's more his ignoring of the Pope that really exercises that Pope. So he does start to think about excommunication. Bruce has, of course, already been excommunicated for the murder of Comyn, although he was released of that by Bishop Wishart. But now the Pope is reissuing the sentence of excommunication. And he does agree that the English candidate, John Egglescliffe, could become the Bishop of Glasgow, though, as I say, that is in name only. He can't set foot in Scotland. At the same time, though, he doesn't close the doors completely. Things get better in England. The king and his cousin exchange the kiss of peace, and that means that there could be a campaign in Scotland. Especially, Edward II is very keen on that because the fall of Berwick rattles him. I think he wants to start reversing, you know, what has now become the whole of Scotland lost to the English crown. So he has to make peace with his cousin. They do that just before the cardinals leave Britain, and then Edward can get on with organising a campaign. And in November of 1318, King Edward receives a papal bull which says he can promulgate the sentence of excommunication from the churches of England. So Bruce, and of course, if someone is excommunicated, that means, in this case a king, that means his subjects no longer are bound by any oaths of loyalty to him. So for those who don't like Robert Bruce in Scotland, and that is quite a number, when one considers that after Bannockburn, all the Scots opposed to Bruce for his murder of Comyn and his seizure of the throne, many people thought he wasn't the rightful king. All those Scots had been forced to accept Bruce as king or lose their Scottish lands, as Bruce had stipulated, after Bannockburn, because clearly Edward II wasn't going to be able to help them. So they'd done that, but they'd done that kind of with their hands up their back. They hadn't wanted to, they just had no choice. So there are a number of Scots in Scotland who are not particularly, don't feel warmth towards Robert Bruce. And technically the Pope has excused him of the oaths of loyalty that they had sworn to him in the aftermath of Bannockburn. I think we have underestimated the impact of the death of Edward Bruce on Scottish politics and on his brother. It is true that Robert Bruce now has a grandson. Marjorie Bruce had given birth to Robert Stewart, 1316-17, so we're talking a one-year-old here. That is where the Bruce dynasty is hanging on by, a one-year-old boy, baby. So the death of Edward Bruce clearly, when you look at what happens, clearly rocked Robert Bruce. And made him think again about the policies he was engaged in. It seems to have made him think that he could no longer afford to ignore the diplomatic side of things, most particularly the Pope. And by the end of that year, so, you know, Edward Bruce dies in October. Presumably Robert Bruce himself didn't hear about it for, you know, a week or so. So we're into November. Almost immediately, Robert Bruce decides to send an embassy to Avignon. Now, nothing had happened in terms of how he was being addressed. He hadn't, as far as we know, he hadn't ever received a letter from the Pope to King Robert. It had suited Robert Bruce to ignore completely the papal missives, and the Pope was absolutely incandescent. That he'd taken Berwick, but more importantly, he'd ignored the papal truce in raiding deep into England, which he didn't need to do. So that's, to my mind, that's about Robert Bruce still, I mean, it's not very imaginative actually, still trying to force Edward II to the negotiating table through military means. But after the death of Edward Bruce, I personally see Robert questioning that policy. and wondering if now he should change tack. So, yep, a Scottish embassy goes to Avignon. And we have the Parliament of 1318, which for the first time really gets to grips with a lot of issues in Scotland that have clearly been bubbling away under the surface and ignored to a large extent because of the war effort as far as the governing elite is concerned. There's an awful lot of law passed, and it's quite clear that Scotland is not in great shape in terms of lawlessness, and that there was even the potential for both people and revenues being salted out of the country. And that may be a reaction to the Pope's sentence of excommunication on Bruce. Excommunication is a serious thing. It's maybe not as serious as we sometimes think it is. It doesn't mean, you know, nobody can get born or die or whatever. But it does mean that, that the church shouldn't be running in Scotland to any great effect. And there's some evidence that maybe the fact that people didn't feel that they necessarily had to adhere to the oaths to Robert Bruce that they had been forced to swear, that they might have been thinking about leaving. There's certainly legislation in the Scottish Parliament to try to stop that, and that would include churchmen as well. So if anybody was examining their consciences about the excommunication of Robert Bruce, then that might hint that this was a serious threat. So 1318 is a very difficult year for Robert Bruce. Obviously because of the death of his brother, but also because his policies were failing. His policies were not getting him any closer to what he absolutely needed. And the future of the Bruce dynasty, and as far as they were concerned, Scotland itself, now rested on an aging king who was not always known to be in great health, and a very small child. It doesn't mean that the Scots stopped raiding. They still continued, but it's quite clear that they were exploring other options. Edward finds out inadvertently because one of his privateers comes across the Scottish ship and manages to intercept letters being sent back to Scotland. The Pope is obviously not that impressed because as far as he's concerned, he wants Robert Bruce to engage constructively in making peace, and he doesn't see any evidence of that. He's still annoyed that his own papal truce has been ignored, and he's still sending out missives detailing Robert Bruce's crimes and misdemeanours, reiterating the sentence of excommunication. And then, just when the Pope thought it was bad, it gets even worse, because he gets a report from one of his archbishops who hasn't actually been in Scotland. He hasn't actually come to Scotland, but he's obviously had somebody has written to him, which it's bad enough that the King of Scots, or whatever he is, and his lieutenants should ignore papal missives. But now the Pope finds out the Scottish Church has also been ignoring the sentence of excommunication and all the other things that the Pope has said. And you know, you can feel the heat from here, from Avignon. At this point in time, of course, England is intent on a campaign in Scotland, which I'm sure Edward II feels is entirely justified by what Robert Bruce has already done. And the English army finally crosses the border in September of 1319. It's not quite sure what it's doing. It looks like it's going up towards Edinburgh, but finally turns back and goes to Berwick. But then Douglas and and Bruce's generals go in. They do a sort of flanking manoeuvre down into Yorkshire and defeat a scratch army that's brought out against them by the Archbishop of York. And then all hell breaks loose in the English camp. People accuse Lancaster of being in league with the Scots, and he leaves. So that's it. It's the end of the campaign. So it's achieved absolutely nothing. But that means that they start peace talks. Now, as far as I'm concerned, both the English and the Scots are using these peace talks now to try to pretend that they're the best peacemakers out there. They're both trying to impress the Pope with their peacemaking, even if neither of them have budged 1 inch from what they're prepared to make peace on. But as a result of the fact that the Scottish Church has been shown to be recalcitrant as far as the Pope is concerned, finally, he loses the plot. By this time, Scotland itself is under interdict, and this is being promulgated from every English pulpit, although presumably not every Scottish one. And finally, the Pope summons Bruce, the King, the Scottish King, members of the Scottish Church, a number of Scottish bishops, to answer these serious accusations against them in Avignon, which, as some of you may know, is the kind of prelude to the Declaration. But by this time, England and Scotland have agreed a truce at the end of 1319, which tags on to the very ineffectual one that the Pope's already had in place. So you can see a kind of grinding to a halt. Both sides have no military options that are working. The English can't mount a successful campaign in Scotland without falling to bits. And they tend to be defeated. They tend to be defeated by a Scottish army anyway, if the Scots actually come out to play. But Bruce doesn't have any answers here. The Irish venture has completely failed. That leaves Scotland's west coast vulnerable to English attack. And it's a bit, for once the Bruces have been shown to be vulnerable. His northern English raids, yes, they're good in terms of bringing in hard cash, but they're not getting Bruce any closer to a peace treaty, which, given that he's now approaching his 50s, which is very, very young, but nonetheless, he is getting on. His legacy, the peace that his kingdom needs for passing on to the next generation is not there. So obviously, the Avignon deadline is the 1st of May, that the king and his bishops are supposed to come to Avignon. And as far as everyone's concerned, the Scots are trying hard to look like they're working hard on peace. And we have the prelude to the declaration. There's a full council meeting at New Battle just near here. And then there's a higher-powered, smaller meeting at Berwick to thresh out what they're going to do in terms of responding to the Pope and his very serious threats against them. And of course, we know that probably in Arbroath, the final text of 3 letters, of course. The first 2 are the one from the King and the one from the Scottish Church, probably because of that deadline. They were the ones who were supposed to come to Avignon. So those letters are sent out and arrive in, I think, in June or July. They had arrived by the summer. So they have to be sent fairly quickly, and they address the issues that the Pope has been banging on about. It's fascinating. King Robert actually sends a letter to Edward II using many of the phrases, so it proves he's got the letters, many of the phrases that the Pope himself has used to Robert Bruce about how they should all be desirous of peace so that they can all go on crusades. He uses exactly the same phrases, well, the Secretariat does, to Edward II. And is now what the Scots are doing is portraying Edward II as the barrier to peace, which they've not been able to do when they've not engaged in this diplomatic process. Yeah, but the Pope's still jumping up and down because no one seems to be paying any attention to them, because 1st of May comes and goes, no Scots. They would have noticed. And finally, I mean, really, he's not left with very many options. So he says, he actually says that in terms of the excommunication, no, Bruce cannot be absolved of the excommunication except if he's actually about to die, in which case it's probably a bit too late. So that's serious jeopardy for your immortal soul there. And then on 29th of July, 1320, it's extraordinary. Complete volte-face. Because Robert Bruce is finally speaking to him. Now, he's not forgotten, and he hasn't even really forgiven all the ignoring that went on before, but with renewed energy, he changes his tune to Robert Bruce. And he actually starts to say to Edward II, you need to get your finger out and make peace with the Scots too. So that is the result of the 2 letters, not the famous one. The Pope, it's ironic that the actual declaration, the letter from the barons, which arrives, I think, slightly later, he writes back to the barons saying, well, thank you very much for your letter. And if you need to encourage your king to make peace, thank you very much. So that's it. That's really the papal response. He does write back to King Robert and to the Scottish Church. He's not forgotten. He's not forgiven. But he's talking to them, and that's all he really wants. And he also, he does, in terms of what the Scots want, what Robert Bruce wants is the interdict to be lifted. And he says, well, we'll not lift it, we'll postpone it for a year. And he threatens the Pope to put the whole issue of England and Scotland and their relationship, bring it to his court. This is something a previous Pope has tried in the reign of Edward I, and that really alarmed Edward, that the papal court might decide on the issue of Scotland and England. I don't think it's a threat that we should take very seriously, because if the Pope was to wade in on one side or the other, there's no way he's going to get peace and therefore his crusade. But nonetheless, it is something that the interdict is lifted for 1 year. So Edward II is worried because with the Scots in Avignon to take the letters is a Frenchman. And as I said, the French have been at peace with England for nigh on 20 years. And this is a worrying sign that there might be encouragement of the Scots from the French side. But on Edward's side, we do have the evidence of a number of Scots who are seriously worried by the direction that Robert Bruce has gone in, and take the release of their oaths seriously. But in the end, they have to flee. This is the period immediately after the sending of the Declaration. There's supposedly a plot against King Robert to assassinate him that involves many of the people who sealed the Declaration. And these are the ones who, as I said, came in after Bannockburn and but really didn't want to accept Bruce as king. So these developments have encouraged them, or in the end, they just have to flee to Edward II. So looking in detail at this period and the relationship with the papacy does show, to my mind, that the military options had ground to a halt, that neither side could deal a killer blow. And therefore both sides, I mean, Edward II was always engaging in both. He couldn't really launch the military option because he was at loggerheads with his own nobility, but he certainly made use of the Pope. Whereas for Bruce, to employ the military option, he had to ignore what the Pope was saying. And it's only the death of his brother in Ireland that brings him to the conclusion that the military options weren't working. He does continue to employ them a little bit, but only until he sees what diplomacy can bring him. And what we see from the Pope's side is that as long as they're talking to him, he will engage, he will not shut the door, but it must be noted, and I don't think people quite realise this, that Scotland remained under interdict right until pretty much the death of Robert Bruce in 1329, and that had consequences, although you could slightly get round them. But because Robert Bruce had the support of the Scottish Church, perhaps it didn't make as much difference as it had in England when King John, when King John was excommunicated by the Pope, he was at war with both the Pope and the English Church. And he actually got a lot of money because he took the English Church's possessions and got the revenues. It's different, completely different for Robert Bruce. He has the Scottish Church on side, and that's been absolutely crucial to supporting him and keeping him, putting him in power in the first place, and waging the war of propaganda that he did so successfully. But Scotland remained under interdict. Robert Bruce, presumably was not milking the revenues of the Scottish Church because they were on his side. There was a 13-year truce agreed with England in 1323, and that was the best that could be got out of Edward II as far as Bruce was concerned. It was the treaty, the final peace treaty of 1328 was technically in the reign of Edward III, but given by his mother, the regent. Only then would the Pope go through with his promise that he would raise the excommunication if there was peace between Scotland and England, and that's exactly what it did. Within only a month or so, 2 months of Robert Bruce's own death in 1329, which I think, just as one final point, might raise questions about exactly how ill Robert Bruce ever was in these periods, because he seems to be on death's door. Every time you don't know where he is, he must be dying again. But the fact that he didn't seek the lifting of the excommunication until right before he died might raise questions about that. So there we are, a whistle-stop tour of the period after 1314 and changes of policy in Robert Bruce. Thank you very much.